Welcome to the This Week in Clean Tech podcast. Each week we speak to a leading CEO, executive, thought leader or insider in the clean tech sector. Each guest shares their thoughts on recent events, their own clean tech story and their vision and hopes for the future. This week our host David Hunt is joined by Devrim Celal, CEO of Upside Energy. Devrim is a highly successful award-winning entrepreneur with a career spanning leadership roles in technology, finance and energy. Educated in Paris, London and Yale, where he was a Fulbright scholar, Devrim has since held senior roles at A T Kearney, where he led strategy development, Sapient, where he established the European operations, and as a partner at Lansdowne Corporate Finance. He is now CEO of UK energy tech company Upside Energy, leading the organisation from its initial days as a startup to its dynamic growth in this fast-growing sector. He is an avid athlete, having been a regular competitor in endurance running events. He runs to promote awareness of and raise funds for MS-related charities. Before we start, a reminder that you can subscribe to the This Week in Clean Tech podcast via iTunes or all of the other usual podcast platforms. That's enough from me. Let's hand it over to David with Devrim Celal.
Hello, Devrim. Thanks for joining us today on the podcast. First, I wanted to go through, you've got quite a varied background across finance and management consultancy for many years. What brought you to the clean tech sector and to Upside Energy?
I would say coincidence more than anything else. At about 2014, I was based in the Middle East running a couple of projects. It was at the point where I was also starting to look for something new. And that's when Graham Oakes, founder of Upside, who also was a colleague of mine from early 2000s at Sapient, reached out with this new brilliant idea he had. Managed to eventually persuade me that it was interesting enough that I initially invested in the business, jumped over as interim CFO to help raise the first round of equity capital from seed investors. And over a journey over the past 4 years or so, moved over to take over the day-to-day running of the business as well.
Okay. Because that seemed... Sorry to interrupt. It seemed that, as you say, the company and Graham had come to fruition through the Nesta Innovation Program, and obviously you received some other grant funding, but clearly you got involved when there was commercial funding stage came about?
A little bit before that. So I got involved 2014. Commercial funding was 2016, April, the first funding round. Okay. And it was really when Graham won the Nesta Dynamic Climate Challenge. He had received a small amount of money to write a business case. And that was the initial point of contact where he thought I could help with that. And then there was a larger funding that came in to do the first proof of concept of the platform, which was at those days all about controlling large volumes of smaller loads in a way to provide a balancing reserve for the grid. And the focus was predominantly around uninterruptible power supplies. And sort of the really small ones, the kind of UPSs that you would buy for your home server that you would typically put under your desk, 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5 kilowatt range. And I came on board during that stage and helped set up some of the early conversations with companies like Emerson Network Power, Schneider, and Eaton, which eventually evolved into our current partnership with Emerson, which to confuse matters is now known as Vertiv.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So that's an interesting point, actually, because we'll go on to how the platform is now and how it's evolved. But unlike a lot of the sort of demand side sector, Upside seem to focus on those smaller domestic, small scale aggregation rather than necessarily CNI or larger scale, unless that's evolved. But what's the particular reasoning behind focusing on that area when everybody else seems to be chasing the sort of the big industrial heavy energy users?
Actually, Upside has gone through a couple of major changes through its life cycle. The initial start was to manage very large portfolios of assets, each one with small loads on it. And that's still our focus. But what we realized once we started with our commercial push, that both regulation and some of the other market dynamics pushed us in the direction of managing larger loads. So if you look at our commercial portfolio today, it's typically loads that go as little as 40 kilowatts, but scale up to 20 megawatt in scale. And we're controlling, generation assets, large-scale lithium batteries, heat pumps, some large hot water tanks. But then if you flip the view into our innovation portfolio, where we're developing things to be ready in a year, 18 months from now, you would see a lot of domestic batteries, domestic hot water tanks, smaller UPSs in that. So our view of the world hasn't changed. Small loads are still quite critical, but to be a commercial business today, you need to focus on C&I customers and some of the large front-of-meter battery projects. Now, the second change with Upside came about early 2018, when we realized that National Grid's ancillary services market was going to decline rapidly in value, or addressable market for the kind of services that we were providing.
Yeah.
And at that point, we decided to take a step back, rationalize our strategy, and came back to the conclusion that we either had to become an electricity supplier ourselves so we can have access to power markets, or to provide a platform to those who wanted to do that. And we went with the second. So we decided to become a software product that we sell to electricity suppliers or other utilities to enable them to control their customers' assets behind or front of the meter and optimize those against price signals, whether that's from power markets or ancillary services or DNO's more locational services. It doesn't matter for us. We just gave them the capability to create that optimization.
Okay, so is that then, in terms of the business model, more so now than the licensing and use of the software platform that you've created, or do you still have and still plan to have assets under management yourself?
So our direction is to be a pure software platform. So we sell our services as a typical software as a service subscription model to a typical electricity supplier like EDF Energy, our first customer in that model. And then it's up to EDF to bring, or obviously we work very closely with them, but it's EDF's customers' assets that come onto the platform. And typically, if we were to find direct customers, we would typically work with a supplier again to create route to market for those customer assets.
Okay, so you'd sort of leverage or work those back to one of your partner organizations.
Correct. And the second, so EDF would be our segment one, so electricity suppliers. Yep. Our second segment today is an interesting one that I don't see many others doing, and that's providing a white label flexibility platform typically to battery manufacturers, though not limited to battery manufacturers. So the case and example is Vertiv. In Q4 last year, we launched the Vertiv Energy Store, which effectively is a white label version of Upside's own platform, but it enables Vertiv to go to its UPS customers, typically data centers or communication infrastructure providers, and sell them a service that enables those customers to monetize existing assets.
Okay, I think one of the things that's really fascinating is around not just the technical advances, but very much more around the business model advances. I was at Eco Summit in Berlin. Actually, we're due to come around again, so it must have been about six to 9 months ago. And a number of the startups that were seeking investment at the time were very much providing, as you say, software as a service into the utility and/or electricity suppliers. And there are, it seems to be much more, I guess, profitable to do that rather than to continue to perhaps try and manage in a market which is very competitive and also quite chaotic in terms of, obviously, policies change and markets change. It's very difficult to read the signals.
That's absolutely right. And utilities I believe, are at the point of starting to change. Typically, they would have asked for a long-term license with support contracts. Usually, they would have asked for a hosted solution for themselves. And what we're seeing increasingly is a shift from that really CapEx-intensive model to a more OpEx-driven model of software as a service.
Yeah, yeah. And some of the utilities, EDF being one, of course, who've made inroads into providing, smart home solutions and sort of integrating batteries and solar and other things. And of course, others will follow. And independents like Zonon have been doing that for some time. But do you see at the moment, obviously UPS has been around for quite some time, and that's a large addressable market. But are you seeing much uptake in sort of behind the meter residential storage? Is that something which is becoming more prevalent from what you're seeing?
I mean, it's one of the areas that we're betting on in the medium term. I think it will take another 18 months to 2 years, and it's going to be in parallel with regulatory change and market reform. The first big step is smart meters. You need to have true half-hourly settlement for residential customers as well, to start opening the benefits of a wholesale power market arbitrage. That's I don't think that will happen for at least another 18 months at a scale that would be meaningful. The second dimension is more driven by market. What we've seen in 2018, contrary to what a lot of people expected, was an increase in the consumer price of domestic storage. And that was purely a supply and demand equation. As electric vehicles, especially electric buses, picked up, they use exactly the same battery technology as a home battery would. So they consumed a lot of those the supply for lithium-ion cells, making the domestic deployment more expensive. And I think we need to see a significant decrease in the cost of domestic batteries before you see a mass-scale take-up. Sure. And I think that the lead indicator into that industry is going to be how housing associations will react. And if they take a view on they need to deploy batteries with their existing PV or their new PV, then that may be the change and the catalyst to the domestic storage market.
Sure. I think one of the issues is in the UK, energy is still actually pretty cheap. One of the big markets for residential storage is Germany, of course, where the actual cost of energy is greater, but they've seen in excess of 150,000, I think, residential batteries deployed so far, which is obviously one of the leading markets. Are Upside focused purely on the UK market, or do you have aspirations or already activities overseas?
We have great aspirations, but I think we're going to have to stay quite focused in the UK market, at least for the next 3 quarters. In parallel, this year, we're looking to do trial or proof of concept deployments in the US in one or two different ISO areas. One of them will most likely be with one of our manufacturing partners, and the second would be possibly with a utility customer.
Okay. As you say, it's sometimes very tempting to rush overseas, and we at Hyperion work with a lot of companies who are expanding geographically, but as you say, I think you need to have a sound footing and a good offering before stretching yourself too thinly.
The one benefit we have now is we've shifted away from a typical services model of a demand response company. Being a software platform, once that's up, running, scaled, managing a broad portfolio of asset categories, then it becomes easier to have distribution agreements with third parties already in those geographies to start going international. But we believe that we're still a couple of quarters away from that.
Okay. And there's a couple of things on the UK market, one of which, of course, was the announcement at the back end of last year about the capacity market changes. Has that sort of altered or affected the business model in any way?
So if you are a battery owner, or if you're planning on developing a battery project, capacity market developments, TCR, have all had, or MCPD if you own diesel generation, have all had, I would say from certain perspectives, a negative impact, especially the way TCR recommendations, if they go into action, which they look like they will have a dampening effect in deployment of batteries. From our perspective, because we have a balanced view on existing assets like UPSs, some generation assets and renewables, and some of the newer projects that are being developed, it will still slow down some of what we're doing, but overall we should be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly I know in terms of new deployment in the last sort of quarter on the strength of still that uncertainty around capacity, it's certainly put a few projects on slowdown, at least before deploying. The other issue is one you touched on before, and it's a significant one, and it's obviously even in the mainstream press on a daily basis, you're seeing the rise of EVs. There has been a lot, and there are trials ongoing around V2G and how we can best utilize what is essentially a whole world of batteries on the grid, at least some of the time. Is that something you're already involved with, or have a sort of the software capable of dealing with the demands that large scale EV uptake would bring in terms of both challenges and opportunities?
So let's take that. I'll take your last question first. So in terms of capability, you're effectively looking at the platform to turn demand up or down at the right time, at the right place for EV deployment. The second level on that one is being able to listen to signals from DNOs, or actually listen to the substation to manage against constraints at that level in real time. The more complex issue is the third level of intelligence, which is how do you manage fleets of EVs, where the larger deployment is going to come in. And these could be fleets of buses, it could be logistic fleets like minibuses, or fleets of companies, company cars, or other similar smaller vehicles. And that's where we're putting a lot of effort into our innovation to understand what's critical about fleet management. And questions are, when and where do you charge it? And by doing that, how do you minimize your cost of charging, but maximize some of the revenues that you can generate as a result of that? Yeah. We're also running innovation projects to understand the balance of on-street or off-street electric vehicle charging, and looking at a problem from a perspective of boroughs and distribution network operators, of where do you place your charge points so that you are not over-constraining your grid infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's clearly one of the huge issues around the uptake. Of course, there are solutions, Ubertris and others, who have sort of on-street parking solutions, but there's still that, who charges when and how. And I just had a conversation this morning actually with a client who have a client who's looking to sort of put 80 charges into a car park for a hotel. Of course, then it's not just having the 80 charges. It's the power to and how to manage that load, and there clearly have to be software solutions that can answer that. Again, it's just such a big market where we saw energy storage had hype for many years, and of course things are happening, but with e-mobility, the hype does seem to be very much being followed through quite quickly with what's actually happening on the ground. Are these innovations things that you've had in for a while? Are you working with other partners like Senex or others on V2G trials or sort of research?
Sure. So we have 3 V2G projects on the go now. One of them is a demonstrator, so we've involved a significant investment into vehicles as well. We have a broad range of partners on those, from EDF Energy to Ubitricity, EO Charging, Good Energy, Universities of Salford and Oxford. So we are quite heavily involved in vehicle to grid, at least at the innovation stage right now. Yeah. We're also kicking off another related project looking at EV forecourts. And how do you manage those? Do you need to put a battery to deal with grid constraints? If you do put the battery, what's the kind of revenues you can generate on that? Could you create virtual private wire to solar farms? And how do you sleeve the energy from the solar farm to the forecourt to make sure that you're using 100% renewables for charging cars that visit you? So we're quite active. I think the beauty of electric vehicles or the whole sector is you got 2 major forces driving it. You got good regulatory targets, you can't have combustion engines after a certain date.
Yeah.
But you also have consumer sentiment that's pushing and that's creating a demand for people to not replace their combustion engine cars with another one, but choose an electric vehicle instead. And pushes by major manufacturers like Volkswagen, Audi, and others, and JLR will have a big impact on the consumer sentiment.
Sure. I think, as you say, there's a bit of a perfect storm in that regard of having that regulatory requirement. Air pollution clearly is a big issue for everybody and something that consumers are much more aware of. And the fact that actually EV cars are just better. And I say that as a former petrol head, that
totally
EV cars are just better.
Totally agreed.
Okay, so there are a number of factors, sort of, if we go back to sort of the overall energy mix, and again, just this week we've seen the cancellation of yet another nuclear build project, and on last week's podcast I was talking about, not necessarily in the UK right now, but certainly in many places that solar and batteries are cheaper than building peaker plants. There was quite a bit of news questioning the energy policy in the UK and how we would cope with the sort of the non-build of some of the nuclear projects that were in situ, and obviously who knows what's going to happen at Hinkley. I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of how the energy mix using renewables, batteries, and demand side could cope with or deal with that generation shortfall?
So one part of me screams opportunity. So you replace the shortfall with intermittent renewables and flexibility, which batteries would be ideal. The other part of me is a little concerned. The timing is unfortunate because when we talked earlier on about the targeted charge review capacity market, kind of regulatory and legal issues impacting development of new projects, my concern is that the shortfall that will be created as a result of these projects being cancelled may be filled by opportunistic projects involving gas peakers.
Right.
And I'm already seeing, some investors into those sectors quickly pulling off some projects off the shelf, blowing off the dust, and looking to go into quick deployment.
Yeah, I guess, as I say, that's unfortunately one of the issues when there is a gap in energy policy, and of course the government focused elsewhere very much on other issues at the moment. So that was an issue, I think, a couple of years ago when there was a big boom of diesel gensets being used in the as peaker plants, and clearly not really what needs to be happening from an environmental or a financial point of view.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of Upside's platform, we touched a little bit on how it differs. It is quite a competitive market. I read a report last year from, I think it was Delta EE, talking about the profitability of, or the struggle for profitability in demand side response. You sort of articulated how you're sort of becoming more of a SaaS model than necessarily a manager of assets. But what do you see as the challenges and opportunities for Upside, particularly in the next year or so?
Yeah. So if we break the market down, and going back to the Delta EE report, Delta EE looked predominantly to what's very commonly, I think wrongly termed aggregators in the UK.
Yeah.
I think I like the US term, the demand response agent, DRA, better. So if you look at that model, it's under a lot of price pressure. So ancillary services, we know how that market has gone, especially dynamic firm frequency response. They need to have access to power markets, so they need to share the value they generate with the electricity supplier. So increasingly, their margins are getting squeezed. And that was our rationale for moving away from being a DRA. The types of models that we are more similar to now is it's again DERMS, distributed energy resource management solution, or a VPP, virtual power plant. And I think different people define these differently. And in those sectors, if you're a software as a service play, the name of the game is volume. You need to spread yourself quite broadly, and you need to look to work with multiple customers in each one of our segments. And we talked about the two segments being utilities and manufacturers. Manufacturers we almost see as a capacity recruitment engine. So as we provide white label platforms to manufacturers, we like to see more capacity through their sales channel coming to our platform. And our third segment is pretty tactically focused on asset owners and funders and asset owners. And that would be typical companies that build large-scale battery and renewable projects. The other customer in that segment would be typically companies like Macquarie Bank, and we do have a partnership with them where they developed a product to lend money to behind-the-meter industrial customers to provide lending for big batteries. And you typically a megawatt and up. And again, we provide Macquarie a platform to help monetize those assets to ensure that their loan gets paid back and they can participate in some of the upside in that revenue generation.
Right. Okay.
So if we're successful in executing our strategy, both in the UK and internationally, that should give us the volume to succeed. Now, taking a different view on the way you define the competitor space, when I look at our competitors in that space, I see more names like Autogrid, which is based out of the US, and Bala. If I go deeper into that, it will be companies like Opus One and Tendril. Potentially Restore, Concentrica, even though it acquired it, is providing it as a software as a service or a platform in some of the more remote geographies like Asia Pacific. And possibly in the UK, the more specific competitor would be someone like Origami Energy. So the competitive landscape for us looks different now than it would have a year ago.
I think that's one of the interesting things, turning around and sort of in terms of the bigger picture. It's really challenging, having been in this sector now since 2007, the clean tech sector broadly, to predict and to do the traditional things like business modeling and business forecasting when there are so many variables and things happen so quickly. You've been in management consultancy for some time and other sectors. How do you feel, or how do you find managing business in clean tech in terms of A, do you enjoy it, and B, what do you think are perhaps some of the unique challenges that are perhaps different from more traditional business sectors?
So do I enjoy it? Tremendously. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it so long. It's not an easy business to be in. You're exposed to a lot of change, which you need to adapt and move, and that's the benefit of a startup. I mean, if as a startup you can't change direction, then you shouldn't be in that business to start off with. The second part, the benefit of being in clean tech, is you get to work with a team that's truly committed in what you're trying to do as a socially responsible business. So if I go back and talk to every single team member within Upside, they would tell you that they work for Upside, for one, because they enjoy doing it, but that enjoyment comes from our mission to help enable the energy transformation. In terms of the difference of running a clean tech business, I have a slightly holistic approach to businesses. I believe that they're all the same, and it took me a long time to get to this point. They all have to make money. They all have to spend less money than what they make, and generate shareholder value. The difference of clean tech to some of the other things I've done in the past, from pure software to commercial real estate development to reinsurance brokerage, is the mission-driven aspect of it. We believe in what we're doing, not because we're going to create shareholder value, but also we're going to do some good for the environment.
Sure. I think that's one of the key factors that brought me in. Originally, I had a renewable energy installation business after a number of years of headhunting. And it's that sort of impact element. And we are fortunate that we work with a number of both established and startup companies and with some great individuals. And as you say, the overriding thing is money's great. And of course, we need to pay the bills. But essentially, there's a bigger mission at hand, and we can play a part in a transition that needs to happen. And that, I should say, helps most people, I think, in the sector get out of bed in the morning.
Absolutely. And I believe in that. I think if you talk to people 10 years ago, this whole concept of double bottom line, most people would have probably thought it was interesting, but few would have invested in it. And I think that view has changed dramatically. Now, investors look for good investments still. That hasn't changed, but there's also a significant focus on looking at investments that have a social and environmental perspective to it.
Sure. Turn the conversation, because again, you've had experience with this, with Upside and beyond, in terms of fundraising and growth. And again, something that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years is that particularly institutional investors and some VCs have become much more aware of the challenges of clean tech startups, but in terms of bringing investment, bringing support, but not smothering that investment, and that seems to have been something that I've seen and anecdotally heard has changed in the last 2 or 3 years. In terms of further fundraising, I guess that you will. I know you bid through the Series A. Are you fundraising in the near future, and how do you see the fundraising mentality, if you like, or the investor mentality adapt into the sort of the nuances of clean tech that is very difficult to predict, and therefore, there's always an element of risk?
So we are going to be raising capital again. It's the inevitable thing in a growing company's mission. We will probably be launching around Q1 this quarter. Okay. Towards the end of it, and it will be targeted for the growth of the business in UK and internationally. And in terms of investor sentiment, I think there's great interest from strategic investors at this stage, because if you look at what major utilities have been doing globally, is that they are either acquiring companies like Upside to bring the skill set in-house. They're developing the capabilities in-house themselves, or they're investing in companies like us to start taking a little bit of a bet in one or two of the players in the marketplace. Therefore, there's quite a bit of interest from strategic investors, whether they are on the utility side or manufacturer side. The clean tech venture capital pool isn't very large still. There aren't that many players, but more and more the what we'd call traditional VCs are starting to look at this space, especially for propositions like Upsides, where we're taking the clean tech space but addressing it with a software as a service model, and that opens up the number of people we can go and talk to. So it'll be interesting raising capital this time around, because last time around our main talk was a scalable model within the traditional clean tech space. Yeah. Whereas this time it's more a software as a service model, but addressing issues within the clean tech space.
Okay. So again, having had experiences across sectors, now looking at some of the challenges of being a CEO within a clean tech startup, of course, my passion is around scaling businesses, and in particular bringing talent in to scale those businesses. But what are some of the challenges that you've both enjoyed and endured in terms of scaling a clean tech business, both financially, in terms of talent, in terms of market conditions?
So the biggest challenge is always going to be, and this is a cliche, is talent. Software businesses are inherently people businesses. Mm-hmm. And at the end of 2017, we're a team of 12. By September 2018, we're a team of 35. And today we're 37. Hiring that team and doing that well to maintain productivity and keep a firm culture was a big challenge. Yeah, and I think we've come through that quite well. And obviously the hiring happened across the whole organization, from your young junior software developers to C-level executives. I think ongoing in our next level, we'll probably push the team from where it is today to a team size of 50-55. So we'll have significant hiring later this year into 2020. And again, that's going to be even a bigger challenge because we'll probably be looking for different types of people. The last hiring round was mostly software engineers. The next level will be operational and commercial people. And in that whole environment, we need to keep talking to our customer base while we grow it, and talk to them about a changing focus of clean tech businesses, because we went from being businesses that had long-term government subsidy models, at least in our asset owners, to becoming a purely merchant risk type of businesses, or addressing issues of merchant risk. And I see that as being the next level of challenge, especially on these new projects, getting the investors to understand the risks around merchant risk and accepting those and continuing to develop new projects.
Yeah. Okay. Jumping back to that, the sort of the growth thing, there's a couple of thoughts, perhaps if you could elaborate on, because I've been through this myself before. I had a company, my first renewables company, and we scaled at triple digits. So we went from about 2 employees to 50 in about 18 months, and incredibly difficult to keep hold of the culture during that process. So a couple of thoughts, if you wouldn't mind. One of which is around how to maintain culture. We touched on this briefly about sort of the mission of the company, but how so many tips or experiences on maintaining culture as you go through that sort of hyper growth. And the other is one that comes up often, is around diversity, and it's a struggle. A lot of our clients ask us to provide diverse shortlists, and we endeavour to do so. But unfortunately, the pool of people within the industry at the moment is quite small, and typically male, unfortunately. What are your thoughts on culture and in terms of creating diversity within a business?
Culture is critical. From very early days of Upside, even when we were 5-6 people, we were clear on what we were trying to do, what our shared values were, and how we did business. That helped us choose the right people, because it's almost like a litmus test to test if someone is going to be able to fit within the organization. We put a lot of effort into hiring. We have multiple stages, well choreographed multiple stages of interviews to make sure we hire the right people. And once people are within the organization, lots of touch points. So daily stand-ups, bi-weekly show and tells, when we can manage bi-weekly, but at least once a month town halls, which are very open forums. People could put questions in a closed box if they want to remain anonymous, and ask questions to the CEO. And the CEO is required to open that box in open forum, read the questions and answer them on the spot. And it's free, an open forum from that point on for follow-on questions and rebuttals. They usually get quite heated and fun at times. And through forums like that, I believe we've managed to keep a very, very open, almost brutally open culture, where people are encouraged to come with their views either openly themselves or through anonymous means if they feel uncomfortable expressing them in an open forum. We'll continue doing that. Now that we've scaled, we're not changing the model. We're going to keep those moving forward. But we also open them to others who are not in the organization. So we bring customers, partners into the organization to see what we do and engage us at a very meaningful level. But also we open it to potentially future teammates. So we run sessions within the office where we invite people to come and participate in them. So that's one thing around culture. I can't remember your second question.
Is there around diversity? But just jumping back on that culture thing, I think it's great to hear, and there are many startups who have that deep focus on getting the right people at the right time and nurturing, and not just when they're in the door is only half the battle. But unfortunately, we tend to see the residue from individuals who've been in a startup environment where it's very much you're a bum on a seat, crack on. And it is a challenge when you're going through super growth to as a management team and as a C-level team to when there are so many things going on to focus on the talent or focus on your team. But it sounds like you've done great steps to do that, which is something that clearly would encourage all startups and founders and owners to do something similar. So diversity was the other question around. I think it's universally held and acknowledged that a diverse team is one that brings value to the business, but it's very hard to achieve sometimes. What are your thoughts on diversity and steps to achieve that?
So diversity is one place where I would raise my hand and say we're poor, close to appalling, and it's not for a lack of trying. So it's an absolute failure. So our female ratio is below 20%. And I was talking recently to a female executive at another startup who seems to be doing better than us. And I asked her, how do you succeed? And her feedback, which we are taking on board, is I get a female to look for female hires. And so she was running it herself, and
Right.
that enabled her to tap into resource pools that we would otherwise wouldn't have been able to. So we're taking that on board, and we're going to do things differently. But diversity is not only gender driven, and some of the other diversity measures we are probably even poorer, and it's again based in Manchester is a great place for us to be at. A lot of talent. But compared to the scale of population of London, it's significantly smaller, which makes those pockets of resource pools even smaller as well.
Yeah.
We're just going to have to get better at managing that and think more strategically on how we go about doing it.
Yeah, it is a challenge. A client of ours, Arenco, who are an energy storage startup we worked with, and we're very keen, as they were sort of doubling in scale, to bring diversity to the fore. And we worked with them across a number of workshops and platforms to make sure we had as diverse a shortlist as possible. And we've done similar things with other clients since. It is a challenge, but I think it's much more than purely just saying we're an open opportunities employer. You have to take steps to be visible and to attract those. And I think some of it comes back to the recruitment process you touched on a moment ago about having a sort of a very precise and very a recruitment process which is structured and is repeated, because I think unfortunately a lot of companies, a lot of startups sort of recruit on gut feel as much as anything, and of course that's important, but you end up then recruiting a lot of people that you like, and that's not necessarily what the business needs, or a lot of you sort of see people that are like you rather than not like you. So there are steps I think businesses can take to just make themselves more attractive and more open and more aware to people from a diversity of backgrounds. And it takes much more than purely saying, hey, we're open for business. But I'm happy to share some more of that.
So I've seen an anecdotal story on that one. A while back, we were being interviewed for an award. And part of the interview, and we were in the final stage, and we actually knew we were the winners. So the organizers had sent in a media crew to do some interviews on video. And they were talking about one of their customers being one of the major football clubs. And they talked a lot about how they would look to hire or bring in, sign up, actually, the right terminology, football players from different backgrounds. So whether this was Muslim or from Far East, and they would go and interview people of their community in the city of where club is, to tell them about the local community, the access to, if it's halal food or if it's a place of worship, that it was available, and talk to other football players in the club of same origins, and go back and tell them that if they came, they would actually be welcomed into the community, into the city, into the club. And I think we need to learn from that. And what you're saying is absolutely spot on. You need to get people to feel comfortable about the place they're going to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a fascinating topic around scaling businesses and doing so in the right fashion. Time's gone on. I really appreciate your time, Devrim, thus far. I mean, are there other insights or anything that you've learned in the last 3-4 years with Upside in particular in terms of scaling and growing a clean tech business?
I think the biggest thing I learned, which is, you asked me this a couple of times and I didn't think about it, but the one thing I learned in the clean tech business is never be shy about doubting your strategy, because things will change and constantly. So that what Bill Gates says, you have to be paranoid about your business and constantly doubt yourself to keep refining and looking at better ways of doing business. I think that's more true for clean tech business than any other business that I've been in.
Okay. interesting insight. Again, as we've talked about, the sort of the need to pivot quite frequently as market conditions and political conditions change. Finally, as an avid reader, always look for a recommendation or thoughts on a book that you've read that's had the most impact on you in the last year or so.
Last year, and so I'm going to cheat on this one. I'm going to give you something that I read a little further back, and two books. You may know the book "Built to Last" by Collins and Porras.
Yeah.
The second book, which I think is Collins only, called "From Good to Great." And right. I've read it about 3 years ago, and it's a lot of our culture and hiring policy and the principles around that. So build the bus, get the driver, but then make sure you have the right people in the seats is what a lot of our culture development and hiring is built around.
Great. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. It's something I have read, but perhaps we'll dig out again. It's always good for listeners always to hear again of sources of information that we can implement or learn from one another. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the clean tech sector, is that there is an openness even amongst competitors to share and to feel that we're on a mission together. And it's great to have had your insight and input today, Devrim. I really appreciate your time, and good luck with the next year and beyond with Upside.
Thank you for having me, David. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us again on the This Week in Clean Tech podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if so, please do share it with friends, colleagues, and on any social media platforms. Also, think about leaving us a review, as it really helps us out. Next week, we will be back with the CEO of a leading EV charging company. We look forward to you joining us again for that one. Goodbye.